Hey guys, so today I am going to be making something of a 101 video where I talk about why I choose to use GNU Linux based operating systems on my desktop computer over the more well-known Microsoft Windows based operating systems that most people seem to run. Now this video is basically me explaining not only the premise of this channel but the reasons why I do so many things in my life as well, because my life sort of at this moment revolves around tech, not only sort of on a personal level but also on a sort of professional level as well. I make my money through tech, and also on a sort of political level as well, because as you guys know, I guess you'd call me a political activist, but considering I sort of like stand in elections, I guess you'd call me a political candidate at times as well. So all of this kind of feeds into it, so it's a big thing for me, which is why this video might be a little bit rambly. It's like the most comfortable medium I feel sort of explaining this kind of thing as well. Also feel free to ask any questions down in the comment section below. I will either try and answer them down in the comment section below or possibly even make another video sort of clearing up any possible confusion with this. Again, also I'm going to apologise if any of the terminology and topics that I cover in this video are either too technical or possibly sort of oversimplistic, depending on, of course, whoever it might be watching this video, but I'm going to try and give this video as broad an appeal as possible. So let's begin at the beginning, which kind of makes sense. What is an operating system? Well, two examples, of course, are GNU Linux and Microsoft Windows. Well, Microsoft Windows, of course, has various different iterations: Windows 8, Windows 8.1, Windows 10. Going back, you got Windows 7, Vista, XP, ME, 2000, whatever. And with GNU Linux, which for the remainder of this video I'm going to be talking, I'm going to be referring to as just Linux. I know a lot of people don't really like that because it's sort of a terminological inaccuracy, but it will stop me from tripping over my words as much. So I sort of just want to sort of set that precedent here now. And there are lots of different versions of Linux-based operating systems. The one that I personally use is one called Linux Mint, but the most well-known desktop one I would say is Ubuntu. But you've also got other ones like Fedora, Red Hat, OpenSUSE. So there are a number of Linux-based operating systems as well. Different Linux-based operating systems generally get made for either different sort of audiences or different purposes. So you might have more corporate-based distributions which might be sort of used in office buildings or in a corporate environment. You've got ones like Linux Mint, which are very much designed for home desktop use as well. And whereas by and large 9 out of 10 times software available for one distribution, or which is basically one version of Linux, will work on another version of Linux. That's not always true, and there's a lot of nuances here, but there is a common kinship between various Linux distributions. That being said, another example of an operating system, of course, is Android, which is nearly exclusive on tablets and phones. You can get Android on the desktop, but it's really not very good on the desktop. There's not really much point on it as well, and it doesn't tend to get bundled in with the other Linux distributions because it's so different. It doesn't use the GNU infrastructure as well. It just uses a common part of the operating system called the kernel. So yeah, and Android is an example of an operating system. iOS is an example of an operating system as well, if you have an Apple phone. Or for some reason you've decided to hack your non-Apple phone to have iOS. I don't even know if that's possible. But I know that you can actually run the operating system that's run on Macs on PCs as well. I think they refer to that as a Hackintosh, which is it's always a concept that has amused me. I've never tried it myself. So yeah, these are platforms that you use to run other software on. This software might be games, it might be your word processor, it might be your internet browser, it might be your email program, but all of these things sit on top of an operating system, and that operating system then sort of talks to the computer on your behalf, as it were. It effectively, in its most simplistic terms, translate what the computer is saying and what the computer is doing into language that you and I can understand. So what is the where to begin now? Microsoft Windows is the operating system that 9 out of 10 people have. It's by far the most well-known one, and if you buy a PC from the shops, you are more than likely going to have Windows pre-installed on it. It is effectively the default operating system of the PC. Almost in a similar vein to how Android is the default operating system for phones that don't come from Apple, as an example as well. It's the most common, it's the most well-known used operating system, but it's not necessarily the best, and obviously what qualifies something as being the best is subjective or dependent, depending on what you intend to use it for. So, why have I decided to remove Windows from my computer and put Linux on top of it? Actually, I didn't do that. I built my computer from scratch, and so it never actually had Windows as a primary operating system on. Okay, so to clear one thing up now, just the first technical inaccuracy that I've said, is that I don't actually exclusively use GNU Linux-based operating systems. I do something called dual booting. I have 2 hard disk drives in my computer, one that is used for Windows 8.1, and one which is running Linux Mint 17.2 Mate edition, if any of you guys are wondering. I'm actually, circling around various different desktop environments, and the Mate version, I'm really enjoying it. Actually, it's a really good, stable desktop environment. So, the difference between Linux, Microsoft Windows. The biggest, most notable difference is that Linux-based operating systems tend to be open source. So what is, of course, open source? Again, in its most simplistic terms, when an operating system is built, the instructions and the everything that is required to make said operating system is available to sort of review, audit, inspect, take away. You can even improve it, you can do whatever you want with it, but the fundamental importance is that you know down to every line of code how your operating system is put together. That is the importance that I personally get out of it, but I know that there are a lot of other people who derive other usefulness from having access to the source code. But to me, the reason why open source is at least relevant in regards to an operating system is that you know what is actually on your computer, and you know what is made up of the software that is running your computer. That way you know that there aren't necessarily security vulnerabilities, or that security vulnerabilities can be patched by any number of people that might want to improve the operating system. It's also that you actually know, again, it's a matter of consent and knowledge. It's very difficult to really give consent to running a piece of software on your computer that you don't actually know what it does, and without access to the source code you can never really be that sure on what a piece of software does. I do make a number of concessions based on this. I have an NVIDIA graphics card and I run proprietary drivers on it, but these are concessions. It's not ideal, but it's sort of a concession that you have to make. But wherever possible, I try and make sure that the source code is available for any piece of software that I'm using. There are some exceptions that I personally make to this that I know other people aren't willing to make. The big notable exception is games. I love playing games on Linux. In fact, one of the biggest positives of playing games on Linux and getting involved in the Linux gaming community is that it is basically what the mainstream gaming community was 15 years ago, when people were significantly more enthusiastic about games, when there was so much more new stuff being tried out. And it kind of feels a little bit like that on a certain side of the indie gaming scene. Not all indie games. Some indie games are Unity asset flips and just trying to cash in for a quick buck. But one of the natural safeguards that an indie development team actually cares about their game, and cares about their game to an extent that they want as many people to play it as possible in whatever way they want to play it as possible, is when an indie game makes a game available for Linux. Because no one makes a game for Linux for the big bucks. No one makes, there's no real money in it. The reason why a developer would port a game to Linux is simply out of enthusiasm for their own game. So there is that kind of safeguard that if you've ported a game to Linux, there's a very real chance, and this isn't applicable in every single case, but I've certainly noticed it's applicable in enough to be merit of note. that there is this degree of enthusiasm and pride in a game that you want to port it to as many different platforms as possible. And therefore, games that are available on Linux tend to have this natural form of quality control, which I think is really, really quite good. And I've been playing some of the most fantastic games that I've been playing lately have come out of that sort of sector of the indie scene, the same sector where like Don't Starve and Neon Struct and I think it's the Master Plan have come in, where they're games that are just trying new stuff in the same way that big game developers were trying new stuff 15 years ago, most notably, of course, Deus Ex. That was the era Deus Ex came out. And yeah, okay, you know, games like Neon Struct will go back 15 years. They will look at what was good about video games and then they will try and bring some of that stuff forward rather than just, again, trotting out a franchise. It's also so much more new intellectual property in indie games as well. In a world where we see, you know, sequels upon sequels and franchises just go on forever. Fast and the Furious 27, a new, you know, like E3, the stuff that most people were excited about was there's going to be a new game of your favourite franchise. Again, I kind of like that. You know, I love the Fallout games. I like Deus Ex, Mankind Divided looks really good and all this kind of stuff. And from a game's perspective, yeah. And, you know, to a degree, maybe that's a failing on my part, that I've just sort of kind of got swept up in the exact same hype that I'm actually trying to get away from. But again, you know, that's just one reason why at least gaming on Linux is something that I've actually really quite enjoyed lately. There are, yeah, so Linux is significantly more secure as well. Now, this is a difficult one to argue because it actually is becoming less and less so as time goes on. Linux used to be so... Linux has not got less secure. Let me just sort of say that now. But the way that unscrupulous people are trying to take advantage of you and whatever vulnerabilities that you might have is changing. And I think the biggest threat to your sort of online safety, mostly, let's say, your bank balance, what's stopping you from getting robbed is not on the desktop end of things anymore. It's not on the software side. It's going to be sort of an online issue, which means that it doesn't matter what operating system you're running, you're still vulnerable from things like phishing, which is when people set up a website that looks just like maybe your banking website or Facebook or whatever, in the hopes that you will enter your username and password into it, and then instead of going to Facebook, it will go to someone who you don't want it to go to, and they can use that to take out money from your account. And yes, you can actually take money out of people's PayPal accounts with a Facebook username and password as well. I actually had it done to me. Fortunately enough, though, PayPal was actually good enough to actually revert the transactions, which actually worked out really, really well. Of course, I'm not on Facebook anymore, but that's a different story. But yeah, in regards to security, I mean, it is secure. I've never had a virus on a Linux machine, and I've deployed dozens of Linux machines in my time. It's just something that doesn't happen, and it's because part of it is because people develop viruses and malware for like the most commonly used operating system. So there is some degree of security through obscurity, but also because of how different programs and how things are allowed and how permissions of various different software and safeguards and all that kind of stuff work in Linux. If you have any kind of sort of comprehension of your operating system, there is not actually a way that a virus can actually sort of break your computer in a way that it can do with Windows. But that being said, though, like I say, the biggest threat to you and your bank balance is probably online, and that's where you need to install the most security nowadays. Anyway, so is it better really? Is Linux a better operating system, or is it a better set of operating systems? This is difficult to say. Because I don't use Linux because it's better. Some ways it's better. Some ways, like I say, you can argue that it's more secure, although, again, that's not necessarily super applicable nowadays. But I don't use it because it's better. The reasons that I use it have changed over time, which is actually quite interesting. I originally started using it just because I wanted to learn about it, to expand, to sort of out of curiosity, out of no other reason than just sheer curiosity. And this was back first time I picked up. It was a copy of Seuss on the front of a magazine, Linux format, I think it was. And I just wanted to dual boot and have a go just for the fun of it, just for the intellectual curiosity as well. Really quite enjoyed it. And they still used KDE as their main desktop environment, which is interesting. So then I tried that out, and I got to admit it was a lot more difficult back in those days. It was a lot more difficult back in those days. And again, better is incredibly subjective as well. I still maintain that Linux is an operating system that requires someone knowledgeable within the vicinity of its deployment. And what I mean by that is I have friends and family who use Linux as well. I know someone who had a terrible old computer, and they were thinking about throwing it out and buying a brand new one for about £400-500 British pounds. That's what, $700-800 American dollars. And I said to them, before you do that, let me load Linux onto it. Right, this was an XP machine, and it was going to be unsupported, and running an XP machine after the support has run out on it is incredibly dangerous, of course. And in fact, I think some banks have actually said, please don't visit our website if you're running an out-of-date operating system, of which XP is now. I said to them, if I can install Linux on it, give it a go for a couple of months. Let me know how you get on. If you have any troubles whatsoever that can't be easily remedied, then go and buy a new computer. You're not out of pocket. I'm just fixing an old machine up for you, which they've still use. Zero problems whatsoever. Oh, there was one minor problem, because it was an old machine, an old XP machine. It had I put Ubuntu onto it, which is the LXDE variant of Ubuntu, a lightweight operating system designed basically to replace Windows XP and to revive old hardware. The one minor problem was that the exit button to shut down the operating system was in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, and when a window was maximized, you'd have the scroll down arrow just like right above it. So if you weren't paying attention, you could accidentally click the shutdown button instead of the scroll down button, because the mouse in question doesn't actually have a mouse wheel. So it was just a matter of, we'll get rid of the shutdown button. You just go to the start button or the menu button and then just go log off, shut down. It was about as easy to remedy as you could imagine. But other than that, piece of cake, job done. It was. I might not necessarily have saved them the £400, because it could just be in a couple of years' time when maybe the hard disk drive gives out or the memory gives out, and then they have to buy that computer again. But I've sort of offset it. I've certainly it's a benefit. It's a good deployment of Linux. But with that in mind, I'm a phone call away. So if something did go wrong, they had that kind of personal support there. And I don't know whether or not, if someone wanted to try Linux out for the first time and who might not have been super tech savvy, and if something goes wrong, they might not necessarily know how to fix it. I think that there is a possibility they could kind of be left in the wilderness there. There is some pretty good support for Linux out there. There's like IRC channels and chat and social media. Reddit is actually, I found, to be really, really good for finding people to sort of help you fix any kind of problems. But that being said, you kind of have to have that that willingness to learn that some people just don't have these days. And I think maybe you could argue that very much is a fault of society and our day and age, but it doesn't, acknowledging that might not make it any less of a problem. But I could very well possibly end up saying that Linux at this moment isn't really for everyone, because I think you still do require this sort of degree of knowledge to get it working to a specific standard, and that knowledge takes time to learn, and I don't know. I don't necessarily know what the solution is off the top of my head here, but to say that someone who just has very little knowledge of computers could hop into Linux and just run at it, no problem, it's not really true, especially if they come into bugs or incompatibility, or even knowing or not knowing whether or not Windows software will run on Linux as well. Some people don't know. And that's again something that might need to be taken into account. There is light on the horizon on that side of things, actually, is because like the likes of Windows and are moving towards an app store for the desktop, or have moved to an app store for the desktop. The idea of repositories and the idea of how software is put onto your operating system is becoming a little more universal. Then, of course, there's that, and I do know that there are a lot of cross-platform efforts as well in terms of package management, which could very well bear a lot of fruit in the future. So when it comes to Linux being better, it's better for me. Like, my desktop runs faster than when it runs on its Windows partition. I only ever use the Windows partition to play games. That's the only thing that I do. I have in the past used it for video editing, but Linux Mint is really quite good at video editing for at least my purposes, so I don't really use that anymore as well. So it is pretty much only games, and I think the last time I booted into it was about 2 weeks ago. So that's just to give you a bit of an idea. Windows 8.1 could very well be the last version of Windows that I actually end up using, because I think Windows 10 is going to is not going in a direction that I like, and that's going to lead me to sort of the final point on my thoughts on sort of operating systems and Linux-based operating systems. It's the most important point. So if you've made it this far into the video, thank you, I guess, and that is the idea of software rights and digital autonomy. The idea that you are in control of your desktop, that you know what your desktop is running, like I mentioned earlier, the idea of open source as well, and the idea to successfully control your operating system as well. One of the things that I really don't like about Windows 8.1 is because I only boot into it once every week, once every 2 weeks, right? And there are plenty of other people that use their computer that often who might have Windows 8 or 8.1, right? Maybe some like elderly people that only use it to do online shopping or to email the grandkids or whatever it might be, and they might use the computer once a week or that kind of time frame. And every time I boot into Windows, every single time I boot into Windows 8.1, updates, and not even like 1 or 2 updates. It's like 30. It is not uncommon for me to boot in, play a game, and then have to spend literally half an hour upgrading a system with no visible benefit, which really does annoy me. There's no way out. There's no way I can avoid it. There's no way I can get rid of it. It's there. It's in my face. It's not letting me choose when I want to upgrade, what upgrades I want to do, how I want to upgrade, when I want to upgrade. No. It wants to upgrade then. It wants to upgrade, when it wants. It wants to upgrade what it wants. Completely outside of my control, and I think that's really quite irritating as well. What I do when I set up like a Linux computer for a friend or family member or someone I know, is that I will only set it to update when I am physically at that computer. So I won't have the update manager on startup or anything like that, because updating is a process that can actually end up breaking your machine. So it is always good that if you're going to do any serious updates, to sort of either know what you're doing or be with someone that knows what they're doing, or at least be in a position where the update, you can afford the update to fail or whatever it might be. But then I just update whenever I sort of personally visit them, and then it sort of works. And I've never had a single problem in all the years that I've been doing that, because people don't want to have an update window flash up in front of them, offering to solve problems they have no idea exist. So there's that kind of thing. You can actually choose, and I like on Linux Mint, for example, is that it gives you a priority order on what your upgrades do, and which upgrades might be like unnecessary, or you might not necessarily be super stable to upgrade at this point in time, and it actually gives you a decent explanation, and most importantly, the choice on what you want to do and when you want to do it. That is the most important thing. In fact, I like how Linux Mint chooses to do its updates. It never does a pop-up. It has an icon in the system tray, and it goes from a green tick to like a blue exclamation mark, and that's when updates are available. Click on it, and it tells you what updates are available. And I only update when there's something that I see that I want to update. It's as simple as that. It's as easy as that. But again, part of that is the privilege and prerogative of actually knowing the ins and outs of my system. Something which Linux allows you to do, something which Windows deliberately hides from you, and it hides it in the excuse that might at one time have been valid of user friendliness, but now people are already required to know so much about computers that they use. They teach IT, at least in British schools as well, and how to use computers, and that includes things like how to we need to know formulas for spreadsheets. We need to know how to use how to protect ourselves online. How browsers work and how plugins for browsers work, and all of these little bits and pieces that make up our operating system. So I don't really think that it is too much of a stretch to actually have people sort of informed on, again, some of the more fundamental parts of their operating system, but I think there just lacks a mechanism and a way to do that. Part of that is because Linux and open source, in a way, the community is almost too smart for its own good. And I see this in politics quite a lot as well, is when you have a community of people that are really intelligent, there is often this disconnect between really intelligent people and people who are not particularly achieved in that department, if I might be as politically correct as I can be. And sometimes you require sometimes there's a requirement for PR to actually explain these reasonably intricate and nuanced ideas to your man on the street, basically, to someone who might not have that much of an interest in it as well. Which is, again, going back to why Linux isn't necessarily for everyone at this point in time. I'd love to see it become universal. I really would, and I'd love to see the community take these kind of steps to make more people be able to use Linux. Without having to be sort of taught by a specific person. Because this, again, comes down to digital autonomy. The right to use software the way you want to use it, to know what software it is you're running, to be able to control that software, and to be able to choose as many different options and factors as possible. And that's really what it comes down to, is choice. The ability to use your computer and the software on your computer in the way that you want to, without interference from anyone else. It's the right to use your property as you see fit. And it's and Linux and the Linux community really celebrate that, and that's why I choose to be a member of it, and why I choose to sort of engage in it, and why I choose to make these videos on this channel, and why I'm so passionate about it, is because it is very much a case of protecting some what are really very fundamental rights surrounding this as well. You see, what's known as the General Public License, or abbreviated to GPL, which is a software license that most sort of Linux open source software is licensed under, is, and I'll link to it down in the description below, but it's, I want to refer to it as a set of terms and conditions, and I guess in theory they kind of are, but they're also a list of rights that you have, and also the developer of that piece of software has, and the people involved in that software have. But the idea behind the GPL is to protect, rights. Some of those rights are your rights that are being protected, and some of them are from the developer. But they're rights that are being protected. Whereas the sort of the Microsoft Windows equivalent, what's commonly known as a EULA, an End User License Agreement, is a document or documents explicitly designed to restrict your rights and do nothing else. Nothing else. And if anyone who's made it this far through the video, who might not be necessarily very technically savvy, and I know the number of people might be very slim on that front, considering a lot of the terminology and tangents that I've gone off onto, but the thing that I couldn't sort of make more important is to read the terms and conditions of those end-user license agreements that people just sort of sign, click I agree, and just think nothing more of it. Particularly when it comes to Microsoft Windows, actually, because the Microsoft Windows, I think it was the Microsoft Windows 10 EULA, but it could very well appear in the 8 and 8.1 EULA as well, that actually says that this operating system reserves the right to collect information based on your input, and it sort of leaves it at that. It's basically protecting Microsoft's right to take your information and whatever information you choose to input into your operating system. That's a big right that you've just given up to use a piece of software that you've paid for but still don't actually own. It actually says also in the end user license agreement of Microsoft Windows, you do not own this piece of software. This is a license. You are paying to let you use our software. You don't own Microsoft Windows. No one owns. Microsoft owns every copy of Microsoft Windows because they license it out. They don't sell you a physical. Like, you do not own your software. You do not own the software that your computer runs on. That's something very, very noteworthy, if nothing else. And at least when it comes to Linux and open source kind of stuff, you own your sort of like copy of Linux, I guess you'd call it. It also kind of makes prominent that ownership in and of itself is kind of a weird, intangible concept, I guess, when it comes to online stuff, because you might own a copy of Linux, or you might own, the Linux Mint software that's sort of on your machine. That's kind of like, not super useful because it gets out of date and it's sort of, it is part of a larger ecosystem as part of the internet. But again, maybe not. Maybe like if you use a computer that's not part of the internet, maybe it's like an arcade machine that wants to play sort of like old emulator games. I've seen that Linux deployed in that instance before, which is really kind of cool. Then I guess it's perhaps a little bit more relevant. Okay, so just to sum up, why I choose to use Linux, it really does come down to the fact that I really kind of want to protect my sort of digital autonomy and the right to use software the way that I want to use it. I could talk a little bit about sort of how privacy as well is an aspect in it, and how in order to protect your privacy, open source software plays an incredibly important role in that. But that might be a video for another day, because again, that's sort of a pretty far-reaching subject. It is something that, again, is important. It is something that is factored into the decision, but it's certainly not a and if I felt that any of the open source Linux-based software that I use does infringe on my privacy, I would stop using it. But to me, it's maybe not the most important aspect of it. I think the most important aspect is the digital autonomy, and maybe that's and that is just me. I mean, I talk about this very publicly, in video form on the internet. So you guys have probably already sort of fathomed that I want to protect the right to privacy, even though I've personally elected to give it up in a lot of ways. I mean, I stand for elections, and you pretty much open up your life to the general public at that point anyway. Not to mention that all this stuff that I put out on the internet as well, I've pretty willingly sort of given up my personal right to privacy, but I will absolutely defend anyone's right to privacy who chooses not to give it up. You have a right to privacy if you choose to accept that right, and that's, again, something very fundamentally important to me. What kind of concerns me the most out of all of this, though, is how little people are actually willing to question not just the kind of software that's on their computer, but the world around them as well. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's this irritation that I have, and it can't possibly just be me. The world is made up of so many people that just consume whatever's put in front of them, not questioning it, and it is epitomized by the trope of people just not reading end user license agreements. And I think that just sort of sums it up. It's like if it's financially free, gimme, no questions asked. And I think we live in, I think we do live in that world where, if something's just given to you for free, you just sort of consume it, no questions asked. And, maybe it's not even necessarily for free. It's not, and it's not just, software. Software is a part of it. Software is a big part of it. But it's just general things in our life, like what we consume. We are a society of consumers, and I think that it's always important to question, where your stuff comes from, where your stuff is made, whether or not your clothes are made in a sweatshop or in somewhere that actually pays their workers a decent amount. Where your food comes from, and whether or not whether or not the source of your food is is sort of acceptable on your personal terms and conditions. Whether or not, for example, because sort of on the political trail, it hits very hard it hits home very hard rather, how so many people in our society just get completely screwed over. And one of the groups of people that get screwed over more than most are farmers, because they get completely screwed over by the supermarkets, which just hammer down their prices to the point where it's really difficult for them to make a living, because the powerful, sort of the massive supermarkets have just basically crushed their ability to negotiate prices, and therefore, it ain't good. It ain't good. So when it comes to sort of questioning where things like your food come from, again, it's important. Maybe you're perfectly happy with where your food comes from, and it's not necessarily just about it's about knowledge, and it's about your personal knowledge. It's not necessarily about your personal politics. Maybe you're fine with sort of eating GM, for example, or maybe you're not, or maybe there are certain elements to it that you don't like. For example, maybe the over-centralization of the economics of the situation, or the lack of regulation, or maybe it's that the environmental concerns that you might have, or maybe it's it's the workers' rights elements to it as well. There are a lot of different sort of political factors that make up even just where your food comes from, as an example, or your electronics, are they made in a sweatshop, or your clothes, are they made in a sweatshop? It's important to question all of this stuff. It really, really kind of is. But a lot of people will then sort of return by saying, well, there is so much stuff in our lives, how do you expect us to Google every single item we own? And I think when it becomes that so that much of a mountain to climb, maybe it's time to stop and think that we're actually consuming too much stuff. I don't know. So, but question everything, man. I mean, there are a lot of people out there who I disagree with on a political level, right? A lot of people. But I still have this fundamental respect for them, in the sense that they at least question the world, and maybe their conclusions are not the same conclusions of mine, but it's seriously. It's a case of just questioning and knowing, and I have a feeling that I really am preaching to the converted when it comes to this one, because there is this feeling in the open source community, and maybe it's why I kind of feel at home here as well. But again, it is this idea that we should know we should educate ourselves as much as possible, and whether or not that's educating ourselves on the software that's running on our computer, and the potential pitfalls of not knowing that, and what other people, corporations, criminals, governments might have to gain from taking away our rights as well. It's something that we all need to be at least aware of. It's the unquestioning ignorance and consumption that really just concern me, really. Because, it's this expectation that if something was up, someone would have done something about it. And the Linux community are the people doing something about it, but you might want to be on that particular lifeboat when your rights kind of get increasingly infringed upon. I'm not going to cover it in this video, but the UEFI nonsense that we've seen over the past 6 months about the possibility of Windows and Microsoft taking even further steps to lock out any kind of competition as well, again, somewhat concerns me. There will always be the ability to get a Linux PC, I have no doubt about that, but the fact that you can actually go down to your local computer shop, buy the bits and pieces to actually put a computer together and then put Linux on it, is something that I quite like. If they start putting that Windows secure, mandatory secure boot on even things like motherboards that you buy from IT shops, then that's like a real problem, because that means you kind of have to import Linux machines from abroad or whatever, which kind of really concerns me, because that's going to drive the price right up. But anywho, enough of my rambling on. Apologies again for this video being just so long, but if you've made it this far, thank you, and that's a very sincere thank you as well. Let me know down in the comment section below if you've made it all the way to the video, and if you have any questions, and I'll try and get on those. That's about it from me today. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I've been Chris Ware, and you've been awesome. Take care now.